The murder of Marilyn Rynn. 3 days before Christmas, in 1995, a woman who had quietly marked her own birthday earlier that week stepped out for an office party in Dublin and never made it home. Her name was Marilyn Rynn, and the science that would one day name the man responsible did not yet exist in any Irish courtroom. Rynn was 41, a civil servant who lived alone in Blanchardstown and was close to her parents and her brother. On the night of the 21st of December, she attended her work celebration, met friends afterward, and took a late-night bus toward home. From the bus stop, she took her usual shortcut through a park, where a man named David Lawler, walking home from his own office party, followed her. And there she lost her life. How does a case with no witnesses and no confession ever get solved? For more than 2 weeks, no one knew where she was. Reported missing after Christmas, her body was found in the park in early January by a cadaver dog. And the freezing winter air had preserved the one thing that would matter most: biological evidence left at the scene. In a warmer season, it might have degraded beyond use. In the cold, it survived intact, waiting for a test that could read it. What did investigators do with it? Something Ireland had never tried before. Gardaí gathered more than 2,000 statements and took 354 blood samples from local men, the first mass genetic screening in any Irish homicide inquiry. It was a vast, painstaking effort, built on a technique still in its infancy. Here is where the story turns, on a single miscalculation. Lawler, then 31, was a married telephone technician with no record at all. He volunteered a blood sample, reportedly after reading about how the process worked and convincing himself the freezing weather would have destroyed anything that could betray him. He was wrong. The sample matched, further testing confirmed it, and he was arrested in the summer of 1996. This was a conventional genetic comparison, the foundational form of the science, not the family tree methods that would come decades later. Who was the man behind the quiet, unremarkable exterior? Someone no one would have picked out of a crowd. He had a steady job, a wife, and a clean history. He pleaded guilty at the Central Criminal Court and received a mandatory life sentence in early 1998, blaming a sudden, uncontrollable impulse he could not explain. It was the first homicide conviction in Irish history secured through genetic evidence, a landmark that changed how the country investigated its most serious crimes. So, where is that landmark figure now? This is the part that unsettles the people who remember the case. Lawler was released on license in January of 2026, after nearly 30 years, having become one of the longest-serving prisoners in the Irish system. Reporting indicates he had been on unaccompanied day release since at least the summer of 2025, roughly 6 months before his formal release, and a journalist confronted him outside a city center shop during one of those outings, shortly after he had been let out to attend a course. He is now reported to be living in West Dublin, his case revisited at length on national radio as the release drew near. How did the family take it? They had fought it for years. Rynn's mother had long said the man responsible for her daughter's loss should never be freed. A plea that captured the helplessness so many families feel as the years pass and sentences run their course. What lingers about this case is the irony stitched through it. A man certain that science could not reach him handed over the very sample that convicted him. A bitter winter that took a life also preserved the proof, and the case that taught a nation to trust genetic evidence ended 3 decades on, with that same man walking free through the streets of the city where it all began. This case ended with a name, a trial, and a conviction. The next would deliver a name as well. But the man behind it had been gone for many years before anyone could say it aloud. The murder of Kathy Hull. She left her apartment to pick up her sister at a shopping center and simply never arrived. That ordinary errand, on a spring evening in 1979, was the last anyone in Kathy Hull's family would hear from her for weeks. Decades would pass before a machine that had not yet been invented finally gave them an answer. Hala was 19, a young woman from North Aurora, Illinois, remembered by relatives as incredibly sweet. The very picture of late 1970s teenage life. She was taken from her apartment complex parking lot, and weeks later, in late April, a young boy fishing in the Fox River discovered her body downstream of a highway bridge. For her family, the discovery answered one terrible question only to open another that would stay unanswered for 45 years. Who had done this? How do you solve a case that has gone cold for nearly half a century? For years, you could not. The investigation stalled, the leads dried up, and Holly's file joined the long list of cases that seemed destined to stay open forever. Then, a different case in a nearby town cracked the door open. Investigators in Lisle had solved a 1970s homicide by exhuming a suspected serial offender named Bruce Lindahl and confirming his genetic profile through a relative. That result, achieved around 2019 and 20, suddenly gave detectives a name worth testing against other unsolved files across the region, including the one belonging to Kathy Hull. But how do you pull usable evidence off clothing that has sat in storage for 45 years? That was the problem that had defeated everyone before. The answer came from a piece of technology a local detective heard about at a training seminar in 2022. A wet vacuum extraction system, operated by a private laboratory in Florida, could lift genetic material that older methods left behind. And a grant covered the roughly $10,000 cost of the test. It was the kind of tool that simply had not existed during the decades the case sat and touched. What did it find? A match so strong it left almost no room for doubt. In the summer of 2024, the lab reported that the genetic material on Holly's clothing was roughly 9.4 trillion times more likely to have come from Bruce Lindahl than from anyone else. The finding was made public that October, 45 years after she vanished on a simple errand. So who was Bruce Lindahl? A name that by then already carried a dark weight. Investigators across the western suburbs of Chicago have named him as a suspect in a dozen or more homicides and a string of other crimes during the 1970s and early 80s. And officials have said that number could still climb as new information comes in. He was not a ghost who slipped away into old age. He was a prolific and dangerous man whose own life ended as abruptly as the harm he is believed to have caused. How did he die? Here is the grim twist. Lindahl died in 1981, at 29, when he accidentally severed an artery while harming another young victim. The man who had eluded investigators for decades had, in effect, been beyond their reach almost from the start, dead before most of his suspected victims were ever connected to him. What did that mean for Hallie's family? It meant an answer, but never a courtroom. Prosecutors stated plainly that charges would have been filed had Lindahl lived. The case was formally closed, cleared by the fact that the man it pointed to had been gone for 43 years. What stays with people about this case is the strange arithmetic of it. A teenager lost on a routine errand. A suspect who died young and violently, taking his secrets with him. And a vacuum-powered laboratory tool, unheard of when the case began, that reached back across nearly half a century to put a name to a loss her family had carried in silence for a lifetime. Here the science pointed to a man already infamous. The next case would point somewhere far more ordinary, to a face the victim had passed on her own street. The murder of Krista Martin. A friend, worried after days of unanswered calls, let herself into the apartment and found Krista Martin on the couch, fully dressed, as if she had simply fallen asleep. She had not. It was the autumn of 1989, and the truth of what had happened to her would take 34 years and a science fiction-sounding breakthrough to reveal. Martin was 20, a Kansas native who had recently moved into her own place in a Wichita neighborhood and was remembered by friends as outgoing and sociable. There was no sign of forced entry. She was found fully clothed, and she had suffered a fatal head injury with no weapon ever recovered. Everything about the scene suggested someone she had no reason to fear. How do you identify someone who left almost nothing behind? In 1989, you preserved what little you had and waited for the world to catch up. Biological evidence was collected and kept, even though the National Genetic Database did not yet exist. And over the following years, suspect after suspect was compared and ruled out. A database check in 2009 produced nothing. The case sat quietly for decades, with detectives at one point traveling through Arkansas, Alabama, and Maryland, chasing leads that went nowhere. Every promising thread frayed before it reached an answer. What finally broke it open? A method that did not rely on the offender ever being in a database at all. In 2020, Wichita police partnered with the FBI, and using investigative genetic genealogy through the laboratory Othram, they built a detailed profile and traced it to a single family in Arkansas. Instead of searching for the man himself, they searched for his relatives, then worked down the branches of a family tree built from advanced genome sequencing carried out at the Texas laboratory. By the spring of 2023, the work had narrowed to one family, and confirmatory samples from relatives that June sealed the identification. Who did those branches lead to? Someone who had been hiding in plain sight all along. The trail pointed to Paul Hart, a man who had lived just 6 houses away from Martin in the same neighborhood in 1989. He had no documented place in her social circle. He was simply a neighbor, close enough to watch and to know her routine, and after her loss, he left Wichita and returned to Arkansas, where he faded into an ordinary life that no investigator had any reason to examine. So, could he finally be held to account? No. And this is the heartbreak at the center of it. Hart had died in a car crash in 1999 in Memphis, Tennessee. For 24 years before his name surfaced, he had already been beyond the reach of any court. What did the prosecutor make of it? A clear, blunt verdict on what might have been. The district attorney said it was the kind of case he would have charged had the suspect still been alive to answer for it. The file was cleared by exception, announced on the anniversary of the day she was found, in October of 2023. Why did it matter so much to the people who worked it? Because Martin's case marked the first time Wichita police had ever used genetic genealogy. It was a proof of concept, a sign that the oldest, coldest files in the department might no longer be hopeless. A loss that had gone unanswered for a generation became the case that pointed the way forward, and detectives have spoken of it as the moment they realized how many other dormant files might finally be within reach. What stays with people about this case is the closeness of it. Not a stranger from another state, not a drifter passing through, but a man a few doors down, someone Martin had almost certainly seen and greeted without a second thought. The danger had not come from far away. It had been living on the same short street, and it took more than 3 decades and a search through his own bloodline to finally name him. This case named one man and one loss. The next would reveal that a single answer can sometimes account for more than one family's grief. The murder of Shannon Lloyd. For 16 years, 2 separate killings in Orange County sat in 2 separate files, each with the same frustrating blank where a name should have been. No one yet realized they were reading about the same man. The first of those losses belonged to Shannon Lloyd, and it would take an entirely new kind of detective work to connect the dots. Lloyd was 23, a Garden Grove woman remembered by her older brother as tough and unafraid. A tomboy who loved horses. In the spring of 1987, she was found in a bedroom she rented, and she had lost her life. Genetic evidence was collected, but the case quickly went cold. How do you catch someone who leaves a genetic trace but no name? For years, you wait and you compare. The first real movement came not from naming a suspect, but from linking 2 crimes. In 2003, the County Crime Lab used the national database to tie Lloyd's case to the loss of a second woman, Renee Cuevas, 27, whose body had been found on a road near a Marine base in 1989. The same unknown man was responsible for both. Now there were 2 families waiting on one answer, and still no name to give either of them. What finally produced that answer? The same family tree science transforming cold cases across the country. In 2021, the District Attorney's Genetic Genealogy Unit identified the man as Reuben J. Smith. It was the kind of investigative work that had been impossible just a few years earlier, building outward from distant relatives toward a single individual. And then came a detail that made the identification airtight in a way investigators rarely get. What was it? A sample that had been sitting in the system for years, waiting to mean something. Smith had been arrested in Las Vegas in 1998 for a serious crime against another woman, and the genetic sample taken at that arrest had been stored. Once genealogy pointed to his name, that old sample was pulled and compared directly. It matched both Lloyd and Cuevas. The science had named him, and the archive confirmed him. So who was Reuben Smith? A man who had lived in Orange County in the 1980s before moving to Nevada. There was a survivor, too. The woman he harmed in 1998 lived, and she later described how terrifying and dangerous he had been, certain she would not have walked away had she not fought. Her account offered a rare, chilling glimpse of the man behind 2 unsolved files, a voice that the 2 women he is tied to never got the chance to give. Could he ever face a courtroom for any of it? No. Smith died in 1999, having taken his own life at 39. By the time his name was finally spoken in connection with Lloyd and Cuevas, in announcements made in 2022, more than 2 decades had passed since he was beyond the reach of the law. What did that leave the families with? An answer and the cold comfort of certainty, but no trial, no verdict, no sentence. The cases were cleared by exception and announced together by the District Attorney's Office and Garden Grove Police. 2 losses finally given a single explanation. For the people who had waited since the 1980s, the man responsible had slipped away long before they ever learned who he was. And no courtroom would ever hold him to account for either woman. What stays with people about this case is the hidden arithmetic of a serial offender. 2 women in 2 cities in 2 different years, their files kept apart for so long that no one saw the pattern. It took a database link to reveal there was one hand behind both, and a search through a family tree to give that hand a name, only to find he had escaped accountability the moment he ended his own life. In these cases, the science kept arriving after the man was already beyond its reach. The next would be different. because this time the evidence put someone in a courtroom while he could still answer for it. The murder of Danielle Van Dam. She was put to bed on an ordinary winter night in a quiet San Diego neighborhood by a father who had no reason to think anything was wrong. He noticed an alarm light and an open door later that night, but did not check on the children. By morning, in February of 2002, she was gone from the family home, and what followed would become one of the most closely watched cases the city had ever seen. Danielle Van Dam was a young girl from the Sabre Springs area, a dancer and piano player with 2 brothers. She disappeared from her home during the night. The alarm was raised the next morning, and after weeks of searching, a group of volunteers found her body in a remote area east of the city in late February. The discovery turned a frantic search into a homicide investigation that would dominate headlines for months. How did suspicion form so fast in a case with no obvious witness? It formed almost at once, and it pointed next door. Within days, a neighbor named David Westerfield, a divorced engineer in his late 40s who lived 2 doors down, was placed under surveillance after he abruptly left home in his motorhome and behaved evasively. He had crossed paths with the family only days earlier when they had briefly visited his home. What detectives needed now was proof, and this is where the case became a showcase for forensic science. What did that science reveal? A chain of physical evidence that was difficult to argue with. Danielle's blood was found on a jacket Westerfield had left at a dry cleaner and inside his motorhome. Hairs and fibers connecting her to his vehicle and his home were identified. Even the family dog's hair turned up on his bedding. Unlike the older cases where genetic genealogy did the work decades later, this was conventional forensic testing, applied quickly and thoroughly. Was it enough to convince a jury? It was. Westerfield was arrested in February of 2002 and convicted that August of first-degree homicide with the special circumstance of a kidnapping, along with related counts. The trial gripped the region for weeks, and the forensic evidence sat at the heart of the prosecution's case, with the defense unable to explain away the physical links between the girl and the neighbor's belongings. The family later recovered a sum in insurance settlements, though no amount could answer what they had lost. What sentence did he receive? The most severe the state could impose. He was sentenced to death in early 2003, and the California Supreme Court upheld that sentence in 2019. For a time, it appeared the case had reached its final chapter. So why is it still in the news more than 20 years later? Because the meaning of a death sentence in California has shifted. In March of 2024, Westerfield, now in his 70s, was transferred off death row at San Quentin to another state prison, part of a program moving condemned prisoners into the general system. His sentence remains on the books, but with the state holding a moratorium on carrying it out, an actual execution is unlikely. His direct appeal has been exhausted, though. As in most capital cases, further legal challenges continue in the background. What does that leave behind? A conviction that is held firm through every appeal, and a man who will almost certainly live out his life in prison rather than face the punishment a jury chose. The legal fight over the verdict is effectively over. Only the long tail of appeals continues in the background. What stays with people about this case is the speed and certainty of the forensic work set against the slow grind of the years that followed. The evidence was gathered in days and secured a conviction within months. A stark contrast to the cold cases that waited decades for science to catch up. Yet more than 20 years on, the resolution remains suspended. A death sentence that exists on paper while the man who received it grows old behind bars. This case reached its verdict more than 20 years ago, with a suspect who sat in the courtroom. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The next would not see an arrest until an aging man was traced to a town far from where it all began. The Catherine Donahue case. An 82-year-old man, living quietly in a North Carolina retirement town, opened his front door to investigators in the spring of 2025. For 46 years he had carried a secret, and a search through a stranger's family tree had finally caught up with him. The story began far earlier, in 1979, with Catherine Donahue, a 31-year-old Union secretary from Arlington, Virginia, who had never married and had no children. On a March night, she had dinner in Georgetown with co-workers, and the next morning a passerby found her in a parking lot in Glenarden, Maryland, where she had lost her life. How does a case stay unanswered for nearly half a century? For Donahue, the answer was simple and bleak. No suspect was ever identified, and the file went cold. Years passed, then decades. The detectives who first worked it retired or died. The witnesses scattered, and the case slipped further from the public memory with each passing anniversary. Her relatives grew old waiting, with only two of them, a brother and a sister now in their 80s, still alive to see what came next. So what finally cracked it open? The same genealogy revolution reshaping cold cases nationwide. The county's cold case unit sent the preserved evidence to the laboratory Othram for advanced genome sequencing, and the FBI's Baltimore field office used that profile to identify a relative of the unknown suspect in late 2024. From that distant relative, investigators built outward, comparing birth records, addresses, and dates until the branches of the family tree narrowed to a single man whose life had intersected with Donahue's corner of Maryland at exactly the wrong moment. Whose name was it? A man who had been living within a few miles of Donahue's world at the time. The trail led to Roger Zodas Brown, who in 1979 had lived in Hyattsville, Maryland, roughly 7 miles from where Donahue was found, before later moving to Pinehurst, North Carolina. There was no known connection between the two of them, no shared circle, nothing that would have placed him on a list back then. Did Brown have a history? He did, and the timing of it is striking. He had served 11 years in prison for an armed robbery in the 1960s and was released in June of 1978. Less than a year before Donahue lost her life. A man freed from a long sentence, back in the community for only months, in the same area where a woman would soon be lost. That sequence is exactly the kind of pattern that genealogy has begun to surface in cases once thought permanently closed. What happened when investigators finally came for him? They did not have to dig up a grave or close a file with a deceased name. On the 11th of March, 2025, the local sheriff's office and the FBI's Charlotte field office arrested Brown at his home in Pinehurst, and he was charged with first-degree homicide and related offenses. After 46 years, a living suspect had finally been named in the Donahue case, and the relatives who had waited a lifetime had something they had nearly stopped hoping for. So is this one over? Not yet. That is what sets it apart. Brown was held in North Carolina pending extradition back to Maryland, where the charges were filed. And as of this writing, the public record on his trial track was still developing. Unlike so many cold cases solved by genealogy, this one points to a man who is still alive, still able to stand before a court, and whose case has not yet reached its conclusion. Anyone tracking it should confirm the current status through the Maryland court records before treating any outcome as final. Here, for once, a living suspect would have to face the system. The next answer arrived too late for that, surfacing only after the man it pointed to had died behind bars. The murder of Estela Mina. She was a high school senior who took a night job as a security guard, the kind of fierce, protective young woman her family trusted to look after herself. On a Saturday shift in the autumn of 1979 in Sunnyvale, California. That job placed her alone in an empty office building with someone who meant her harm. Elena Mina, known as Estela, was on duty at an office building when she was set upon in the lobby and fatally harmed during the confrontation. An office worker interrupted what was happening, causing the man to flee, and Mina was rushed to a hospital, where she later lost her life. The interruption may well have been the only reason the building did not see a second loss that night. How do you catch someone who runs before anyone gets a good look at him? In 1979, you collect what you can and hope the future will be kinder. Investigators recovered around 30 items from the scene, but the only foreign genetic material was a trace of blood on a door frame. That profile was uploaded to the national database in 2011, and it returned no match. The case became one of the very first taken up by the county's cold case unit, established in 2011 by the district attorney to revisit exactly these kinds of files. And still, it would not give up its answer. What finally changed? Not a new database search, but a better look at old evidence. In 2023, the county crime lab retested items of Mina's clothing that had never been sampled before, using far more sensitive instruments, developed a fresh genetic profile, and this time the national database returned a hit. This was not a family tree case at all. It was a delayed match, made possible purely because laboratory tools had grown sharp enough to read material that earlier machines had passed over entirely. The evidence had been sitting in storage the whole time, holding an answer no instrument could yet extract. Who did the match point to? A young man who had been a visitor to the area, not a local. The profile belonged to Samuel Silva, 18 at the time, a Colorado resident who had been staying with relatives in the county. Investigators believe the two may have crossed paths earlier, when both worked at a local amusement park, which would explain how he came to be near her without raising alarm. After the crime, Silva fled back to Colorado, and for decades no one connected him to a security guard lost in a Sunnyvale lobby. What had become of him in the years since? A great deal, none of it good. Silva went on to accumulate a long record of serious crimes across more than one state, and his genetic profile was entered into the national database in 2006. Yet because Mina's own evidence had not yet yielded a usable profile, the two could not be linked until the clothing was retested years later. The information to solve her case existed in the system. It simply had nothing on her side to match against. Could he ever be brought to account? No. Silva died in a Colorado prison in 2008, while serving time on a separate offense. By the time the improved testing finally named him, he had been gone for 15 years, and the case was cleared by exception, announced in 2023. It later featured on a national news program in early 2026, alongside another solved Sunnyvale case, a sign of how much attention these long-buried files now draw and how rare it is to see one resolved at all. In this case, the science worked to name a guilty party. The next would do the opposite, using the same tools to undo a conviction and free a man who had served decades for something he did not do. The murder of Rhonda Wicht and her son. This is the case where genetic evidence did not catch anyone. It set someone free. In 1978, in Simi Valley, California, a young mother and her small son lost their lives. And for nearly 39 years, the wrong man paid for it. The mother was Rhonda Wicht, 24, found in her apartment alongside her young son on a November morning, both of them lost in the same terrible event. With the scene deliberately staged to look like a burglary gone wrong, it was a family member who made the discovery, and the staging would point investigators in a direction that, for nearly 4 decades, turned out to be the wrong one. How did the wrong man end up convicted? Suspicion fell fast and never moved. Police focused on Rhonda's former boyfriend, Craig Coley, a 31-year-old Navy veteran who had served in Vietnam and was working as a restaurant manager. The two had recently parted. A neighbor reported recognizing his truck, and items were taken from his home. His first trial ended without a verdict, a hung jury unable to agree. But he was convicted at a second trial in early 1980 and given 2 consecutive life terms with no chance of release. On paper, it looked closed. A former partner, a familiar vehicle, a guilty verdict. The case was the kind investigators rarely revisit. Was there anyone who doubted it? One man never stopped. A detective named Mike Bender had quit the department in 1991 over his own doubts about Coley's guilt and spent 29 years working to free him. His conviction that the wrong man had been caught never faded, even as the years stacked up and Coley remained behind bars. In 2016, a new police chief reviewed old material and reopened the file, asking Bender and a cold case detective to look again with fresh eyes. What they found changed everything. What did the evidence reveal? Something everyone had assumed was gone. Material once thought destroyed was located in storage, and biological samples were tracked to a private lab. Testing on a swatch from the bedsheet revealed genetic material from an unknown man, and it was not Coley. The proof that should have cleared him decades earlier had survived all along, waiting for someone willing to test it. What happened to Coley then? Justice, finally, though it could never give back what was taken. The governor pardoned him in November of 2017, and he walked out of prison after nearly 39 years, the longest wrongful incarceration overturned in California history at that point. Settlements followed, including a $21 million agreement from the city, with additional compensation from the state and the county, bringing the combined total to roughly $25 million. No sum could return the decades he had lost, the years that ran from his early 30s into his late 60s behind bars for something he did not do. So, who was actually responsible? That is the part that still haunts the case. The genetic profile from the scene has never been matched to a known individual. After the Golden State case broke open in 2018, police even requested a comparison, and the notorious offender behind it was tested and ruled out. Coley himself offered a $50,000 reward for information leading to the person who did it, determined that the truth not die with his own freedom. Is it solved now? No. As of this year, the case remains open, with no new suspect publicly named, and a book published in 2025 revisited it with Rhonda's sister. The science that exonerated an innocent man has yet to identify the guilty one, and a city that wrongly imprisoned someone for nearly 4 decades is still searching for the right answer. In each of these cases, the science worked to name a guilty party. The next also began by accusing the wrong person, yet it would end with the real answer, and a moment no one investigating it will ever forget. The murder of Jessica Baggin. The state of Alaska once put the wrong man on trial. In the small town of Sitka, in 1996, a young woman vanished while walking home from a family celebration, and the case that followed would wreck one innocent life before finally, 2 decades later, finding the truth. The young woman was Jessica Baggin, who left a gathering at her sister's home and set out to walk roughly a mile to her own. She never arrived, and 2 days later, searchers first found her belongings, and then, a short distance away, her body near a wooded bike path. She had lost her life. In a town as small as Sitka, the loss landed hard, and the pressure to find someone responsible would shape everything that came next. How did an innocent man end up accused? A local maintenance worker named Richard Bingham, who struggled with serious cognitive difficulties and a history of alcohol-related blackouts, came to police saying he was having flashbacks. And after hours of intense interrogation, he gave a recorded confession that contained no accurate details about the crime. He was arrested within days. But at his trial in 1997, his public defender, Galen Payne, showed the confession had been coerced through a high-pressure questioning method and that nothing physical tied him to the case, and the jury acquitted him. Even so, he had already spent roughly 13 months in jail and would live under a cloud of suspicion in his small town for 23 more years. So who really did it? The answer came from the science that has rewritten so many of these stories. In 2018, Alaska's Cold Case Unit sent the evidence to the laboratory Parabon, which generated a detailed profile and used public genealogy databases such as GEDmatch to construct a complex family tree, leading to a former Sitka resident named Steve Allen Branch, by then living in Arkansas. 2 genealogists pieced the tree together over many months, and a sample from one of his relatives pointed straight at him as the most likely source. Had Branch ever been on the radar? Disturbingly, yes. Just weeks before Baggins' loss, Sitka police had investigated Branch over a separate crime against a coworker. He was later acquitted of that as well. He had lived along the very road near where Baggin was found, and he left Alaska for Arkansas around 2010, drifting out of the case as quietly as he had entered it. Why he was never pursued at the time, while the system was focused instead on an innocent man, remains a painful and open question. Then came the moment that defines this case. In August of 2020, investigators traveled to Arkansas and interviewed Branch. He denied involvement and refused to give a sample. And about 30 minutes after they left, he took his own life. Testing carried out afterward confirmed that he was the source of the evidence. The man who had eluded the case for 24 years was gone within half an hour of being confronted, taking with him any chance of a trial or an explanation. What did that leave behind? A case closed by exception, with no trial possible, and an innocent man, Richard Bingham, who by then was retired in Washington State and living with a serious illness, left to wonder whether any compensation would ever come for the years that had been taken from him. He has said he feels owed something for what he endured, but as of the latest reporting, none had arrived. The real answer had surfaced too late for everyone touched by the case. In Alaska, the answer arrived only for the man behind it to slip away in an instant. The last case would see the science carry all the way to a courtroom, and an aging man finally answering for a loss from decades before. The murder of Karen Stitt. The trail, when it finally warmed, led to 4 brothers from Fresno, and only one of them was the answer. For 4 decades, all investigators had was a genetic profile with no name attached, belonging to whoever had taken the life of a high school student in 1982. Karen Stitt was a high school student who had recently moved to California to live with her father. On a September evening, she visited her boyfriend in Sunnyvale, and he walked her to a bus stop near midnight. The next morning, a delivery driver discovered her body not far from that stop, where she had lost her life. How do you find someone who left only an anonymous genetic trace? For decades, you could not. The boyfriend was the early suspect, but was conclusively ruled out by testing in the early 2000s. And the unknown profile sat in the national database without a single match year after year. The case went cold and stayed that way for the better part of 40 years, until a Sunnyvale detective named Matt Hutchison took it on in 2017 and refused to let it rest. What did he do differently? He turned to the family tree science that older investigators never had. Beginning around 2019, a Sunnyvale detective worked with a genetic genealogy expert, and by 2021, they had narrowed the search to one of 4 brothers from Fresno. It was painstaking work, building a tree outward from distant relatives and then closing in. 3 of the brothers were eliminated through traditional records research. That left one name standing. How did they confirm it? With a quiet, careful piece of police work. Investigators obtained a covert sample from the trash of one of Gary Ramirez's daughters, and the result showed a high probability that the child's father was the source. A court-ordered cheek swab from Ramirez himself confirmed the match in April of 2022. After 4 decades, the profile finally had a name attached to it, and that name belonged to a man no one had ever suspected. Who was Gary Ramirez? Someone whose clean record was the very reason he had never been caught. He had grown up in Fresno, served in the Air Force in the early 1970s, and lived in places from the Bay Area to Hawaii, with no prior criminal history, which is exactly why his genetic profile had never been in any database. For 4 decades, he had lived an apparently ordinary life, building no record that could ever have flagged him. He was arrested in August of 2022 at his home in Makawao on Maui, thousands of miles from where the case began. Did this one reach a courtroom? It did, and that is what makes it the rare exception in this collection. Ramirez pleaded no contest to first-degree homicide in February of 2025, and that May a judge sentenced him to life with the possibility of parole after 25 years, the maximum available under the laws in place in 1982. Because the case fell under an older legal framework, that 25-year term was as severe a sentence as the court could impose. He was 78 by the time he was sentenced. What does that sentence really mean for a man that age? In practical terms, it is a life sentence. Ramirez is now in the custody of the state correction system, and given his years, the 25-year minimum is one he is unlikely to outlive. The specific facility was not announced, but the outcome is plain. An elderly man will spend whatever remains of his life behind bars for a loss he caused 4 decades earlier. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.